Get ready for a chilling night. Immerse yourself in horror stories that will accompany you until you sleep. If these dark narratives help you delve into the world of dreams, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more eerily peaceful nights. Driving at night had always been a hassle for me, but not because of the darkness or tiredness. I absolutely hated driving past that cemetery on my way home. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't quite explain. It might sound like one of those campfire ghost stories or a spooky tale meant to make you uneasy, but to me, it was all too real. It all started a few years ago when I was still working at my old job. To avoid the city traffic, I'd end up taking a quicker route that, unfortunately, passed right by an old cemetery, one of those places with crooked gravestones and moss growing everywhere. My routine was simple: leave work, drive down the deserted road, and finally pass that dreaded cemetery. At first it was just uncomfortable. I'd get a shiver running down my spine every time I drove by. But what really began to terrify me was one particular night, when the rain was coming down in a steady, fine drizzle. The sound of the rain hitting the car's windows was hypnotic, almost lulling me into a sense of calm, until something in the rearview mirror made me freeze. There was a man sitting in the back seat. I turned my head immediately, hoping not to see anything. But he was there, a thin man with a neutral expression, just sitting there. He didn't look threatening, but the fact that he was there, with no explanation, left me paralyzed. I couldn't come up with a rational explanation. I could only see him through the mirror, as if the dark interior of the car had come alive. It wasn't like the scary stories you read. This was really happening. Fear climbed up my throat, but I knew screaming wouldn't help. I kept driving, focusing on getting home as quickly as possible. He didn't say anything or make any sudden movements. He just sat there. The only sounds were the rain and the muffled hum of the engine. When I finally got home and turned off the car, I looked in the mirror again. He had vanished. I spent the rest of the night awake, thinking about what had happened. I didn't want to tell anyone. Who would believe me? It would sound like one of those spooky stories people share online to scare others, but this wasn't just a scary tale. It was my reality. The following days were worse. I couldn't shake the episode from my mind. I tried to avoid driving past the cemetery at night, but in a small town like mine, alternative routes were limited. Deep down, I hoped it was just a trick of the tiredness. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but that didn't last long. It wasn't something you could ignore. One night, there I was again, stuck on the same route. The rain was heavier this time, creating a curtain of water that made it hard to see ahead. The sounds of the rain were more intense. Each drop hitting the windshield seemed to echo in my brain, almost a haunting rhythm. As I drove slowly through the dark stretch by the cemetery, I felt the presence before I even looked in the mirror. He was there again. The same man from before, sitting in the back seat. This time his expression seemed slightly different, as if something inside him had changed. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but there was a tension in the air. Something heavy and inescapable. My heart started pounding faster, and I had to fight the urge to stop the car and run. But I knew that wouldn't help. Turning off the car or abandoning the drive wouldn't make a difference. He didn't seem like a real person, but at the same time, he was there, as solid as I was. I tried to concentrate on the road, ignoring his presence, but it was impossible. It felt like he was watching me, but without using his eyes. The sensation was physical, almost palpable, and the fear grew, suffocating. I got home again, exhausted, as if I'd run a marathon. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, it became clearer that this wasn't just a coincidence, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew I had to keep passing that place. There was no choice. By the third time it happened, I knew what to expect. The routine was the same: work late, take the deserted road, and pass the cemetery. This time, though, I was prepared in a different way. I had decided I wouldn't look in the rearview mirror no matter what happened. I thought maybe if I didn't acknowledge his presence, he wouldn't show up. It was a desperate attempt to maintain some control over the situation. The night was dry this time, without the rain sounds to distract me, without that constant noise that somehow helped dilute the fear. The silence on the road was absolute, only the sound of tires on the asphalt echoing around me. I passed by the cemetery with my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. For a few seconds I thought it had worked, but soon I felt the same chill running down my spine. I knew he was there, even without looking. My breathing grew heavy, and panic began to crawl inside me. It didn't matter whether I looked or not. He seemed to know I was aware of his presence. And then, something different happened. For the first time, he spoke. "You can't keep ignoring me," he said in a deep, almost hoarse voice that echoed through the car. My whole body froze and I nearly lost control of the steering wheel. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say or if I should say anything. I just kept driving, as if I could ignore his voice as easily as I ignored his presence. But he continued, "You're going to listen to me, sooner or later." There was an urgency in his words, but also a strange calm, as if he knew I had no choice but to face him eventually. When I finally got home, he disappeared like before, but his words lingered in my mind, echoing like one of those horror stories you never forget. What did he want? Why did he keep appearing? I knew it wouldn't end until I faced what was happening head on. The fear grew worse each night, becoming unbearable, but part of me knew running away wouldn't help. That last night when I came home, a strange sense of acceptance washed over me. I decided that if he appeared again, I wouldn't ignore him. It had to end, one way or another. As I passed by the cemetery, there was no surprise. I felt his presence before I even heard his low sigh, almost as if he was tired of waiting. He was there, in the back seat, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I looked straight into the rearview mirror and stared at that man, hoping some explanation would come to light. He seemed solid, real, like just another passenger, but his presence weighed in the car, as if he occupied much more space than his thin body suggested. "Why are you here?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice sounded firm, but there was an underlying tremor, a mix of fear and curiosity. He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me through the mirror, his eyes empty, dull, but intense. Finally he spoke, and his words carried a weight I wasn't expecting. "I can't rest," he said. "I'm stuck here, waiting for someone to see me." There was a sadness in his voice, something deep and painful. It wasn't like the vengeful ghosts or malevolent entities we hear about in scary stories. He seemed lost. I realized at that moment that his presence in my car wasn't a threat. He just wanted to be seen, recognized. "Do you want me to do something?" I asked, not knowing exactly how to help. There was something in his words that made me feel a strange empathy. He shook his head slowly, as if he already knew the answer. "Just see me," he repeated. And that's what I did. I didn't look away. I didn't run. I just stared at him through the mirror until, slowly, his figure began to fade away. Not abruptly, but as if he was dissolving slowly, carried away by the wind. When I got home that night, for the first time in weeks, he wasn't there. The back seat was empty and the car felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off me. I never told anyone this story until my nephew mentioned, years later, that he hated passing by that cemetery because a man's ghost always got into his car. That's when I realized that some horror stories are true. They're not just night tales meant to scare you to sleep, but a reality that repeats itself, waiting for someone willing to see. Working double shifts had never really bothered me much. I was used to the exhausting routine, those long days that started early in the morning and dragged on until late at night. Back then, I'd drive home, covering miles of empty roads. The night was a thick curtain of darkness, pierced only by my car's headlights and the occasional street light. Standing like solitary guardians along the way, the hours dragged on, and exhaustion mixed with monotony, creating a deadly combination that slowly pulled me towards sleep. But that night was different. It was drizzling lightly, the kind of rain that doesn't force you to stop but lulls you into a trance. The sound of the rain tapping on the windshield began to blend with the hum of the engine, and before I knew it, my eyes grew heavy. I thought about turning on the radio, maybe tuning into one of those spooky late-night stories to keep me awake. But all I wanted was silence, the kind of silence where you can hear your own breathing. Time seemed to stretch, and my body, too tired, craved only one thing: sleep. The road stretched on, and my mind wandered between random thoughts. I started to remember those ghost stories friends would tell around the campfire. How we'd laugh afterward, pretending we weren't scared. They were true stories, or at least that's what everyone claimed, though no one really believed them. But that night, on that road, something felt different. The rain grew heavier, and the darkness around me seemed to close in like a heavy cloak, making every mile feel longer. Then, something changed. The silence that had once been comforting became oppressive. It felt like the dark surroundings were coming to life, like the shadows dancing along the road were creeping closer. My eyes started to close, and I could no longer fight the fatigue. The image of the road blurred, turning into an indistinct mix of asphalt and darkness. That's when I heard it. A voice. It wasn't a scream or something terrifying. It was a whisper, soft and gentle, like a thought slipping into my mind. Wake up. The word was spoken with an almost maternal softness, the kind of tone you'd use to wake a loved one. Instantly my eyes snapped open. The road ahead of me had transformed into a nightmare. Construction barrels were just a few feet away, ready to be smashed by my speeding car. My heart raced, and in a desperate reflex, I yanked the steering wheel hard, nearly veering off the road. The car swerved, but I managed to regain control. I pulled over to the shoulder and stopped, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The voice still echoed in my mind. Who had whispered to me? The rain kept falling, now mixed with the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Whatever that was, it had saved my life. I knew that much, but I also knew that being woken up by a voice from nowhere wasn't something that could easily be explained. I looked around at the dark surroundings, and the road seemed even more terrifying. I was alone, or at least that's what I thought. My heart was still pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. I was parked on the side of the road, the engine still running, and my headlights illuminating the wet pavement ahead. The rain, now heavier, created an irregular symphony on the car's roof. For a few moments I sat there, breathing deeply, trying to calm myself down. The voice that had woken me still echoed in my mind, repeating that single command: wake up. But what disturbed me the most wasn't hearing the voice, it was the strange sense of familiarity it carried. Without fully understanding why, I felt the urge to check my surroundings. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something in the darkness of the road, but everything seemed calm. The highway, deserted at that hour of the night, was the perfect backdrop for a horror story. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought. Those scary tales, those true stories we used to hear when we were younger, seemed to have found a new stage that night. But who or what was behind the voice that woke me up? Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the result of extreme fatigue. But something inside me whispered that there was more to the story. I decided it was time to get back on the road. There was no point in sitting there feeding my own fears. I needed to get home and try to understand what happened, if there was anything to understand at all. With my hands gripping the steering wheel, I started driving again. But now, every shadow seemed to hold meaning. Every noise became a sign. The silence that once comforted me now felt like a threat. It was as if the dark environment around me was waiting for something, a wrong move, a distraction that could catch me off guard. As I continued down the road, I tried to push the scary images out of my mind. I started thinking about bedtime stories, the kind my mom used to tell when I was a kid. They were calm, comforting nighttime tales, nothing like the terrifying stories that had been running through my head, but the memory of them brought me a brief moment of peace. However, that peace didn't last long. The rain began to fall harder, and my car's headlights barely cut through the heavy curtain of water. I was alone, surrounded by a world of shadows and rain, fighting to stay focused. And then, it happened again. The car radio, which had been off until now, suddenly switched on by itself. A low static filled the car, growing slowly until a distinct sound emerged. The same voice. "You need to pay attention," it said, this time with a slightly firmer tone. My breath caught in my throat. What was happening? It was as if the car itself was trying to warn me about something, but what? The voice disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving me in a state of confusion and fear. Now, it wasn't just the road that seemed dangerous, but the very act of continuing to drive. For a moment I considered stopping again, waiting for the rain to let up and trying to think things through. But I knew I couldn't sit there for long without panic taking over. I had to keep going. I had to get home. The dark surroundings felt more oppressive than ever, and the road, which had once been just a passage, now seemed like a path to something much darker. But I had no choice. I turned on the radio, trying to drown out the feeling that I was being guided by something beyond my control. And I continued on, not knowing what else the night had in store for me. The road ahead of me seemed to stretch endlessly, like I was stuck in an infinite loop of darkness and rain. Despite the exhaustion weighing on me, the adrenaline from fear kept me wide awake. The radio, which had been emitting nothing but static, and that eerie voice was now silent again. But the echo of the words "you need to pay attention" still lingered in my mind. What did that mean? What else was I supposed to notice on this hellish night? My eyes were fixed on the road, but my thoughts began to drift. In my head, the words mixed with fragmented memories, moments from my life that surfaced for no apparent reason. It was like my mind was trying to show me something I had missed or forgotten. The rain kept falling, turning the landscape around me into a blurry mess. The sound of raindrops hitting the car roof was the only thing keeping me grounded in the present. A constant rhythm that stopped me from completely losing myself and my thoughts. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made me instinctively slam on the brakes. By the side of the road, a figure appeared briefly, only to disappear into the darkness the next second. The car screeched to a halt, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. It was impossible to be sure what I'd seen, but the vague shape seemed human. I swallowed hard, trying to decide whether I should keep driving or check out what that was. But the thought of stepping out of the car on that deserted road on that night seemed more terrifying than moving forward. Yet, curiosity and the strange sense of duty made me act. I turned off the engine and, with trembling hands, grabbed a flashlight I always kept in the glove compartment. Opening the car door felt like stepping into another world, a place where the night was even darker and the rain even colder. I stepped out onto the road, shining the flashlight towards where I thought I'd seen the figure. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, but revealed nothing except the empty road and the trees swaying in the wind. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, almost swallowed up by the rain. No response, just the constant sound of water falling and the rustling of leaves. But something inside me told me I wasn't alone. I felt a presence, something invisible yet palpable, watching me from the shadows. The dark environment around me seemed more threatening than ever, like the night itself was conspiring to swallow me whole. My body was on high alert, all my senses sharp for any sign of movement or sound. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds, I got back in the car. As soon as I closed the door, I felt a little safer, though still deeply unsettled by what had just happened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and started the engine again. I was determined to move on and leave that horrible night behind. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, a chill ran down my spine. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something in the back seat, something that vanished as soon as I blinked. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was lodged in me like a thorn. The road seemed even longer now, stretching out with every mile I covered. The rain kept falling, relentless, and the radio, despite my attempts to ignore it, began to hum with a faint static again. Something was approaching, something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. And the voice, that voice that had woken me before, seemed to be waiting for the right moment to return. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that the night was far from over, and that the worst was yet to come. The road felt more suffocating with every meter I drove. The steady rhythm of raindrops on the windshield mixed with the low hum of static that refused to leave the radio. That unsettling feeling of being watched, of not being alone, grew stronger by the minute. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but my thoughts were a whirlwind, and indistinct images danced in my mind. Something was about to happen, something inevitable that I would have to face head on. My vision began to blur again, and my body felt heavier. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the creeping drowsiness. Then I heard it again, the same voice, but this time there was urgency in its tone. "Don't swerve," it whispered, firm and direct, as if it knew I was on the verge of succumbing to sleep. Panic shot through me. What was it trying to tell me? Don't swerve from what? And then everything happened at once. A pair of headlights appeared ahead of me, flashing frantically. It was a truck, barreling straight towards me. The sound of its horn and the roar of its engine tore through the rain and darkness. It was as if time slowed down. I had a split second to react. I remembered the voice, "Don't swerve," and something deep inside me decided to obey. I kept my car in a straight line, gripping the wheel tightly, my eyes locked on the oncoming headlights. Then, like a miracle, the truck swerved at the last second, veering off the road and passing so close that I felt the wind from its massive frame shake my car. The deafening sound of the truck's brakes echoed into the night, followed by an eerie, all-encompassing silence. I pulled over a few feet ahead, trembling from head to toe, unable to process what had just happened. The rain kept falling, lighter now, almost as if it was trying to soothe the remnants of the night. But inside me, a storm still raged. Who was that voice, and why was it guiding me through this nightmare? I looked around, expecting to see some sign of the truck, but the road was empty again, as if the danger had never been real. Still shaking, I rested my head against the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. It felt like I was trapped in an endless nightmare, a cycle of terror and confusion with no escape. And then, for the last time, the voice spoke again, this time with a tenderness that sent chills down my spine. "You're safe now." I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing those words. When I opened them again, the road ahead of me looked different, less threatening, more real. The rain was starting to ease up, and I knew that the worst was behind me. I started the car again, this time with a strange sense of relief and exhaustion. I kept driving, knowing that I was just minutes away from home. As I continued, I noticed that the shadows no longer scared me the way they had before, and the silence that once felt oppressive now seemed comforting. Finally, I saw the faint light of my driveway. A sense of peace washed over me as I pulled in. I parked the car and got out, leaving the door open for a few seconds, as if I needed one last connection to the outside world before closing myself off. The night was calm now, the dark atmosphere dissipated by the soft glow of my porch light. As I walked towards the door, I glanced back one last time at the road I had just left behind. A thought crossed my mind, that voice. Maybe it was someone or something that had always been with me, something that had always watched over me from the shadows without me realizing. I walked into my house, shutting the door behind me, and collapsed onto my bed without even bothering to change. Exhaustion finally overtook me, but before sleep claimed me, one final thought crossed my mind. That encounter on the road, would it become just another one of those scary stories, the kind that's true but no one would believe if I told them? Or would it be something I'd eventually forget with time? I didn't know, but one thing was certain. That night, I had experienced a strange kind of terrifying comfort, a type of horror that, as frightening as it was, had also been my salvation. As I drifted off, the soft sound of rain, now reduced to a gentle patter, became the last ambient noise of the night, and for the first time in many hours I felt like I could truly sleep in peace, knowing that no matter how terrifying the night had been, I was safe. I've always loved driving at night. There's something almost meditative about the soft hum of the engine, and the way the asphalt stretches out endlessly beneath the wheels. That night, I was on my way to Oklahoma City, leaving Wichita Falls, Texas. The digital clock on the dashboard read 4:05 a.m., and a growing anxiety gnawed at me. Afraid I'd miss my flight back to Pennsylvania. The Interstate 44 stretched ahead, empty at that hour. The cloudy sky let out a light drizzle, creating the perfect atmosphere for spooky stories. The sound of the rain tapping on the roof was hypnotic, keeping me awake but strangely relaxed. As I drove, my mind wandered. This late-night drive had all of the makings of one of those campfire horror stories. The darkness that surrounded the road, broken only by my headlights, seemed to hide shadows dancing at the edges of my vision, almost morphing into characters from some creepy tale. I was just about to turn on the radio, hoping to find a story to keep me alert, when something caught my eye on the horizon. A faint glow, barely noticeable at first, started to emerge by the side of the road. As I got closer, the glow intensified, and my heart began to race. A chill ran down my spine. The air around me felt different now, heavy with a strange, unsettling energy. I knew I was about to witness something that would challenge my grip on reality. Little did I know, I was about to become part of a true horror story. As I approached the light, my eyes widened in shock. An old car, either light blue or silver, suddenly shot out from a ditch on the side of the road. Flipping through the air like it was defying gravity, it tumbled end over end 3 or 4 times, metal twisting and glass shattering in a surreal symphony of destruction. Amid the chaos, I saw something that froze my blood. A human figure was thrown from the vehicle, spinning through the air like a puppet with its strings cut. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain intensified, almost as if nature itself was reacting to the horror I was witnessing. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called 911. My voice was shaky as I gave the GPS coordinates to the operator. She told me to stay put but not to return to the highway. A patrol car was less than 2 minutes away. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the crash site, waiting to hear the sirens any second. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. My mind oscillated between shock and worry for the possible victims. The horror stories I'd imagined just moments before now seemed childish compared to the brutal reality unfolding before me. After about 20 minutes, the silence of the night was broken by the ring of my phone. It was the police. The officer on the other end, sounding confused, asked me where exactly the accident had occurred. I repeated the information, feeling a growing sense of unease. His response left me stunned. He was at the exact location I had described, but there was no sign of an accident. No skid marks, no shattered glass, not even crushed grass. It was as if the event I had witnessed had never happened. After that disturbing night, I couldn't get the incident out of my head. The images of the crash replayed in my mind like a looped movie. I knew I needed to understand what had happened, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desperate need for answers. As soon as I got home, I began a frantic search. I typed keywords related to the accident on I-44 near Lawton and sifted through the results. That's when I stumbled upon an old news article that made my blood run cold. 10 years ago, on that very date, a group of teenagers had suffered a fatal accident on that stretch of highway. The description of the accident was eerily familiar. 6 teens in a 1986 Oldsmobile lost control of their vehicle, flipped over the guardrail, and rolled down the embankment. All of them died at the scene. The most chilling detail: the time of the crash, 4:05 a.m., the exact moment I had witnessed the impossible scene. My mind struggled to process this information. Could it be that I had seen some sort of time echo of that tragic event? The horror stories I used to listen to for fun now felt painfully real. In the days that followed, sleep became a challenge. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to that dark road, hearing the metallic sound of the car flipping and seeing the body flying through the air. What had once been just a simple night drive had now turned into a vivid nightmare. The experience from that night started to consume me. I couldn't sleep without artificial rain sounds playing in the background. A desperate attempt to recreate the atmosphere of that night and maybe find some sense in what had happened. Eventually, I decided to return to the accident site, driven by an almost obsessive need for understanding. I arrived just before dawn, the sky painted in shades of gray and purple. The place seemed to conspire to keep the road's secrets. I pulled over onto the shoulder, exactly where I'd seen the car appear out of nowhere. As I walked the area, I scoured every inch for some kind of evidence. There was nothing but tall grass and a few scattered rocks. I was about to give up when I noticed something glinting in the vegetation. As I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. It was a small piece of twisted metal with traces of light blue paint. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was real, tangible proof that what I'd seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. In that moment, the weight of the truth hit me. True horror stories aren't just tales told to scare, they're realities that escape our understanding. I looked out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise, chasing away the shadows of the night. I realized I had become part of something bigger, a witness to an event that transcends time and logic. The spooky stories I knew were just the tip of the iceberg of a world far more vast and mysterious than I had ever imagined. I got back into my car with the fragment of metal in my pocket, a tangible reminder of that impossible night. As I drove home, the sound of the rain on the windshield mixed with the distant echo of a crash that had happened a decade ago, but somehow continued to reverberate through time. I knew I'd never see the world the same way again, and that the late-night stories I'd hear from now on would carry new meaning, a constant reminder that reality is sometimes stranger and scarier than any fiction. The rain was falling relentlessly, creating a liquid curtain that blurred the city lights. Sarah, a 32-year-old accountant, sat in my car, my hands still shaking after the heated argument with Mark, my ex-boyfriend. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m., too late to be out on a Friday night. "You'll never change, Sarah," Mark's words echoed in my mind. We'd ended our 5-year relationship months ago, but he still insisted on having talks that always ended in fights. I sighed deeply and started the engine. The drive home would be long, especially in this weather. As I navigated the familiar streets of the city, something felt off. The streetlights flickered erratically, as if reacting to the storm. A shiver ran down my spine, reminding me of the ghost stories my grandmother used to tell on nights like this. Leaving the city behind, I turned onto the winding road that cut through the forest. The sound of the rain grew louder, creating an almost hypnotic background noise. The radio only picked up static, adding to the sense of isolation. Suddenly, something darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I saw a human figure, but when the headlights lit up the spot, there was nothing there, just my imagination. I muttered, trying to calm myself. But the unease lingered, as if the night was hiding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. As I continued down the road, the forest seemed to close in around me. The wind whipped through the trees, making their shadows dance in eerie, unnatural ways. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves seeped into the car, bringing back memories of childhood camping trips and the scary stories told around the campfire. I tried to distract myself by going over my to-do list for the next day, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the fight with Mark. "You live in a world of numbers, Sarah. You never see what's beneath the surface," Ed said. His words bothered me more than I wanted to admit. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. In that brief moment of clarity, I saw something that made me question my sanity. At the edge of the road, partially hidden among the trees, stood a tall, dark figure. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't an animal. It had a human-like shape but was twisted, elongated. I blinked, and the figure was gone. "It's just exhaustion," I told myself. But the rapid beat of my heart told a different story. I pressed down on the gas, eager to leave that stretch of road behind. The clock read 3:15 a.m. when it happened. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, and I could see the distant glow of the next town. That's when I saw them, 2 glowing points ahead, like eyes reflecting my headlights. I slowed down, thinking it was an animal on the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was much larger, about the size of a small horse, but with the shape of a giant feline. Its fur was so black it seemed to absorb the light, creating a void in the damp night. My whole body trembled as the creature turned to face me. Where the snout of an animal should have been, there was a human face. It wasn't a mask. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a real face, with eyes that stared at me with an unsettling intelligence. I froze, unable to move or look away. The face was that of a man, older, with mature features. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, more sinister. His mouth moved, as if he was about to speak. At that moment, headlights appeared behind me, flooding the scene with light. A truck. When I looked back at the creature, it was gone, leaving only an empty road and the quiet forest. The truck passed me, honking its horn. The sound snapped me out of my trance and I slammed my foot on the gas. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it over the roar of the engine. In the rear-view mirror, I saw nothing but the darkness of the road I'd left behind. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station, my hands trembling so much I could barely grip the steering wheel. The attendant, an older man with kind eyes, looked at me with concern. "You all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated. How could I explain the unexplainable? I saw something on the road, something that shouldn't exist. He studied me for a moment before responding. "You know, that road has a lot of stories. Not all of them are for just anyone to hear." His words sent a chill through me. You've heard of something like this before?" He nodded slowly. "Some folks say on nights like this, the borders between worlds get blurred. But they're just stories, right?" I paid for the gas with shaky hands and got back on the road, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Mark's words echoed again. "You never see what's beneath the surface." Now I wasn't sure I wanted to. I made it home just as the first light of dawn broke the horizon. Exhausted but unable to sleep, I turned on my computer and started researching. I found forums and websites full of strange creature sightings. Many described experiences eerily similar to mine. Hours passed as I delved deeper into this world of conspiracies and supernatural encounters. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as fiction, but the memory of those eyes, that face in the darkness, was too vivid to ignore. When I finally went to bed, the sun was already high in the sky. I closed the curtains, plunging the room into artificial darkness. I put on a playlist of rain sounds, trying to find comfort in the familiar noise. As I lay there, exhausted yet alert, I realized my life had changed forever. The world I knew, ruled by numbers and logic, now seemed fragile. Just a thin layer over a universe full of mysteries and terrifying possibilities. I fell asleep with a new resolve. The next time Mark accused me of not seeing beyond the surface, I'd have a story to tell. A real story. A story of horror that defied reality itself. And as sleep finally took hold of me, one nagging thought lingered. Those eyes in the darkness? Were they watching me now? I was barely keeping my eyes open as we drove through the deserted stretch of I-44, inching closer to Oklahoma City. It was 4:05 a.m. and the only sounds were the rhythmic hum of the engine and the steady patter of rain against the windshield. I glanced at my daughter, who was gripping the steering wheel with a concentration that made me even more anxious. We had a flight to catch, and I kept reminding myself that this was the last leg of our journey. Just as I was beginning to let my guard down, something caught my eye. Off in the distance, through the hazy darkness and rain, I saw an old car, a light blue or silver, careen off an embankment. The vehicle tumbled end over end, the metal twisting and screeching in a horrific ballet. My heart lurched as I saw a figure, a human being, flying through the air amidst the chaos. It was a sight I couldn't unsee. and it made my stomach churn. I didn't hesitate. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I gave the dispatcher our GPS coordinates. I asked if I should go back and check, but the dispatcher, calm and collected, told me not to move. An officer was already on his way, she assured me, and should be there in less than 2 minutes. The minutes dragged on like hours. Every second felt like an eternity. As I stared out into the dark, rain-soaked night, the anticipation of the police arriving and my overwhelming fear of what we had witnessed made the waiting unbearable. When my phone rang 20 minutes later, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the police. The officer's voice was even more unsettling than the night itself. He informed me that he was at the coordinates ID given him, but couldn't find any trace of an accident, no skid marks, no broken glass, not even flattened grass, nothing at all. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I repeated the details as clearly as I could, but the officer's tone was matter-of-fact, dismissive. I drove home with a gnawing unease, the rain's rhythm against the windshield almost hypnotic. When we finally arrived and I had a moment to breathe, I turned to the one tool at my disposal. The internet. My search led me to a chilling discovery. 10 years prior, at exactly 4:05 a.m., a group of teenagers had lost control of their 1986 Oldsmobile on the very same stretch of road. The details matched eerily an embankment, a fatal tumble, and a tragic end for all 6 occupants. The coincidence was too precise, too horrifying to ignore. I could hardly sleep that night, the echoes of the accident and the unanswered questions swirling in my mind. I wondered if the rain sounds and dark ambiance of that early morning had been a backdrop to something more sinister, a chilling narrative woven into the very fabric of the road we had traveled. The days following the incident were restless. Each night, I replayed the events over and over, the images of that old car and the figure in mid-air haunting my dreams. My daughter tried to comfort me, but I knew she was as unsettled as I was. We'd come home from the trip, but the true stories of that night felt like they had followed us. One evening, unable to shake the feeling of dread, I decided to revisit the location. I drove back to I-44, hoping that seeing the area in daylight might help me make sense of the haunting vision. As I approached the overpass, the highway looked completely ordinary, just as it had during our first drive. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clear, but the sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. I pulled off the road and parked in a small area near the embankment. The environment was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional rustle of leaves. I walked to the spot where I had seen the accident unfold, looking for any signs that might explain what had happened. The ground was undisturbed, and there were no remnants of a crash. The overpass stood silent, a cold witness to the night's events. As I stood there, I noticed a small plaque on the side of the road, partially obscured by vegetation. Curiosity piqued. I brushed aside the leaves to read it. The plaque commemorated the tragic accident from 10 years ago, listing the names of the 6 teenagers who had died. The words felt like a punch to the gut. These were real people with real stories, and yet their final moments seemed to blur into the darkness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized the implications. Had I witnessed a reenactment of a past horror? The chilling narratives of that night seemed to come alive in the dark ambiance of the present. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of fear and disbelief that had been gnawing at me. Was it possible that the souls of those who had died were somehow replaying their last moments? The thought was almost unbearable, but I had to know more. I began to investigate further, hoping to find some explanation that would put my mind at ease. I reached out to local authorities and looked through historical records, but all I found were the same details, no new information, no clues about the inexplicable experience. The more I delved into the story of the accident, the more I felt like I was chasing shadows. Each attempt to uncover more details seemed to lead me back to the same chilling place, a place where the lines between past and present blurred. The plaques and memorials told a story of loss, but they offered no answers to the haunting vision I had witnessed. One night, unable to shake the eerie feeling, I decided to listen to some rain sounds on my phone, hoping it would help me relax. The rhythmic patter of the artificial rain was oddly soothing, but it also brought back memories of that dark, rainy night on the highway. As the sounds played, I couldn't help but imagine the overpass bathed in the soft glow of my car's headlights, the rain blending with the unsettling sight of the accident. The more I listened, the more my mind drifted back to the overpass. I recalled how the darkness had seemed to deepen around us, how the rain had taken on a sinister tone as we watched the car tumble through the air. It was as if the environmental ambience of that night had been a prelude to something far more sinister. The chilling narratives of that night seemed to seep into every corner of my thoughts, turning them into a relentless loop of fear. One evening, I decided to take a different approach and visited a local library to research any similar incidents or reports. I hoped that perhaps there were other stories, other witnesses who had experienced something similar. The library was quiet and the musty smell of old books filled the air. I pored over local news archives, hoping for a clue that might explain my experience. My search turned up nothing new, no additional reports or similar accounts of supernatural occurrences on that stretch of highway. But as I sifted through the old newspapers and articles, I noticed an odd pattern. Many of the stories from that era mentioned a strange, almost inexplicable feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight. It was as if the highway had been a silent witness to countless unnerving experiences, each one contributing to the dark ambiance that now enveloped my thoughts. As I left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The true stories and creepy tales I had read seemed to mirror my own experience, but they lacked the personal connection that made the fear all too real. I had glimpsed something that night, something that the darkness and rain had tried to conceal. Months had passed since that night, but the unsettling feeling never fully left me. The overpass became a symbol of something I couldn't quite grasp, a reminder of an encounter with the unknown. Every now and then I'd drive by that stretch of highway, hoping to confront the mystery that had intruded on our lives. One particularly quiet night I found myself drawn back to the overpass. The rain had started again, a gentle but persistent drizzle that seemed to wash the world clean. I parked in the same spot I had before, feeling the familiar shiver as I stepped out of the car. The air was heavy, the dark ambiance thick with the promise of something unseen. I stood there in the rain, trying to connect with the place that had become a source of relentless fascination. As the water trickled down my face and soaked through my clothes, I could almost hear the echoes of the past mingling with the present. The sensation was intense, like being on the edge of a revelation that refused to come fully into view. Suddenly, I noticed something unusual, a small handwritten note stuck to the plaque I had seen before. The note was faded and weathered, but the words were still legible. It read, "We're still here, reliving the moment, over and over. You saw what we couldn't let go." A chill ran down my spine. The note seemed to confirm what I had feared all along, that the accident wasn't just a random event, but something with a lingering presence. The chilling narratives and true stories I had encountered were not just tales, but parts of an ongoing tragedy that had left its mark on the highway. The plaque, the rain, and the dark ambiance seemed to converge into a single disturbing realization. I felt a mix of relief and horror. The truth was more unsettling than I had imagined. The past was not merely a series of events, but a living memory that could reach out to those who ventured too close. The supernatural element I had sensed was not about ghosts or entities, but about the echo of human experiences that refused to be forgotten. As I drove away, the rain continued to fall, and the overpass receded into the distance. The true horror stories of that night had revealed themselves in ways I hadn't expected. The chilling compilation of events had left a mark on me that would never fully fade, a reminder of how the past can intertwine with the present, leaving behind an indelible trace. My life has always been wrapped in a peculiar darkness, One that doesn't just come from the lack of light, but from the eerie silence that accompanies the late hours. Driving through the region, about 30 miles east of Cleveland, had been part of my routine for years. I drove a 30-foot Freightliner, an imposing truck that cut through the asphalt in straight lines, traversing small towns and winding roads surrounded by dense forest. The routine was solitary, but I always enjoyed the peace the night brought. Route 322 West was my favorite, despite the almost oppressive feeling of being surrounded by trees that seemed to go on forever. The two-lane road was often swallowed by thick fog that clung to the asphalt like a living entity. Sometimes, I could barely see a few meters ahead, and the sound of the rain drumming on the truck's roof was my only company. I had grown accustomed to these rain sounds, almost like they were a sleep aid, some sort of relaxing terror that kept me alert but comfortable in the solitude of the night. Every curve, every mile, was etched in my mind. I knew exactly where each hill started, where the road seemed to vanish into the darkness, only to reappear at the last second. But that night, something was different. I could feel it. There was a tension in the air, as if the forest was watching, waiting for something. I tried to shake off this feeling as I adjusted the radio, searching for something to fill the silence. Just distant sounds, familiar static mixed with ambient soundscapes that almost made me relax. It wasn't the first time I'd heard creepy stories about the area. Drivers always had something to share during the occasional gas station meetups. Horror stories, true stories, night tales meant to pass the time. But somehow, that night, those stories seemed a bit closer to reality, and as a Mar-like terror resonated in my ears, a chilling compilation of events I hoped never to witness. And in that setting, amidst the dense fog and the monotonous sound of tires on wet asphalt, I saw it. At first, it looked like just a shadow on the horizon, something I could easily ignore. But the shadow grew, taking shape. And then, in the moonlight's flash, something huge and unexpected came flying toward me. The reaction was instinctive. As soon as I noticed the silhouette expanding in my field of vision, I dropped the steering wheel and ducked below the truck's dashboard. My heart raced, pounding in my ears as the world around me seemed to freeze for an eternal second. Then came the impact. A sharp, loud thud echoed over the cab, reverberating as if the metal was crying out in pain. For a brief moment, the silence returned, dense and oppressive, only to be broken by the irregular sound of rain still hammering on the truck's roof. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I sat up again. My eyes were fixed on the asphalt ahead, waiting to see anything that could explain what had just happened. But the road was empty. Just the stubborn fog, the still trees, and darkness. My thoughts were racing, trying to process what that could have been. An animal? Maybe some kind of bird? But the sound was too heavy for something that simple. And it wasn't just the impact. It was like there was something more, something I couldn't define. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I eased on the brakes, and the truck began to slow down until it came to a complete stop. I knew I should get out and take a look, but at that moment, an inner voice told me to stay within the relative safety of the cab. The other voice, however, the voice of curiosity, wouldn't let me be. I needed to know. I needed to see what had happened. With trembling hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt and prepared to get out. The rain now seemed heavier, as if the dark environment around me was trying to swallow me whole. I opened the truck door and stepped down slowly, feeling the cold of the wet asphalt under my feet. The fog still lingered, distorting shapes and creating shadows that shouldn't be there. I walked around the truck, my steps echoing on the empty road, each one more hesitant than the last. When I reached the back, I looked at the path behind me, and that's when I saw it. About 50 meters away, something lay at the edge of the road. It was large, about the size of a man, maybe even bigger. My heart raced again, and I didn't know whether to approach or run back to the truck. But my feet kept moving forward, almost as if they had a mind of their own. Each step seemed to last an eternity as the wind carried the sound of the rain unevenly around me, creating an atmosphere of relaxing terror, if that makes any sense. When I got close enough, I could see better. The thing was motionless, lying on its side. In the dim light, I could make out a body covered in a sort of dark leather, almost like bat wings. It was impossible to describe accurately. It didn't look like anything I had ever seen. I stood there, frozen, staring at it, while my mind desperately tried to find a logical explanation. I remained still, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature, with its distorted supernatural appearance, lay unmoving. In the gloom, the details blended with the fog, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It wasn't an ordinary animal. It was too big, too grotesque. Its wings, if you could call those large dark membranes that, were folded beside its body, and even on the ground, it seemed the size of an adult man. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the constant sound of rain, a sort of ambient soundscape that, instead of calming, only heightened the tension in the air. My eyes couldn't look away from what was in front of me. I wondered if I should move closer, or finally give in to the growing fear and run back to the truck. Part of me tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a large raptor ID never seen before. But another part, the one whispering at the back of my mind, knew it wasn't just an animal. It couldn't be. Suddenly, without any warning, the creature moved. A jerky, almost violent movement made my heart leap into my chest. It rolled onto its side awkwardly and stood up on two legs. The sight was terrifying. There was nothing natural about that posture. The creature was tall, almost as tall as me, and its wings now stretched menacingly beside its body, as if preparing to attack or flee. In the brief second it stared at me, I felt a wave of dread sweep over me. Its eyes were empty, inhuman. I didn't know whether to run or scream, but before I could decide, the creature crouched and leaped into the air. Its wings flapped forcefully, creating a sound that seemed to mix with the rain, and in a few seconds it vanished into the night sky, disappearing among the fog and the shadows of the trees. Everything happened so fast that for a moment I stood there, completely still, trying to understand if it had really happened or if my mind was playing tricks on me. When I finally managed to move, my legs were trembling, as if they were about to give out. I took a deep breath and looked around, still expecting to see some sign of the creature. But everything was silent again. The only witnesses to what had happened were the deserted road and the relentless rain. I hurried back to the truck, feeling fear pulsing through every part of my body. The adrenaline was still rushing, but at the same time, a strange exhaustion began to consume me. Before getting back in the truck, I glanced once more at the road. The mark in the mud right in front of the truck's box was still there. It was huge, with a wingspan of about 6 feet wide. It didn't look like a feather mark, but rather something akin to leather or maybe bat membranes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if the creature left one last trace of its existence before disappearing into the night. I climbed back into the truck, my heart still pounding. I slammed the door shut, as if that act could somehow seal the fear outside. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel again, trying to force my thoughts back to reality. I took a deep breath, counting to 3 before turning the key in the ignition. The familiar sound of the engine brought a temporary comfort, a small fragment of normalcy amid the chaos. As I drove the final miles to Chesterland, I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. Every turn, every moment of silence between the rain and the tires on the wet asphalt, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping, maybe, to see it again. But everything was quiet. The road, the forest, the night sky, everything seemed to have returned to that usual routine, as if nothing unusual had happened. But I knew what I had seen, and that would never leave my mind. When I finally reached the gas station in Chesterland, I parked the truck under the flickering fluorescent lights. It was still raining, and the sound of the drops hitting the roof now seemed like a relaxing terror, almost a sleep aid after what I had been through. I opened the cab door and stepped out, feeling the cold rain against my face, trying to clear my thoughts. But as I passed by the truck, I stopped. The marks were there, imprinted on the front of the aluminum box, exactly as I remembered. Those marks were impossible to ignore, huge, distorted, resembling the wings of a giant bat. Reality blended with the scary stories I used to hear during delivery nights. They were always just scary tales, stories told by tired drivers to pass the time. But now, I had my own terrifying narrative, a real horror story that felt like it came straight out of a movie. Only this wasn't a movie. It was real. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't resist the urge to touch the marks. My fingers brushed the cold surface of the metal, and I felt a shiver run up my spine. There was nothing I could do to erase it. It was etched not just on the truck, but in my memory. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and continued my route. But the fear wouldn't leave me. With every shadow that crossed my path, every strange sound the wind carried, I wondered if the creature was watching me from somewhere, ready to appear again. When I got home that morning, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of the rain still falling outside. What had I seen? Was it a hallucination? A trick of my senses? Or perhaps a manifestation of something I couldn't understand? The questions kept me awake, and the answers, if they existed, always seemed to elude me. In the end, I gave up trying to understand. The truth is, some horror stories are better when we don't know the ending. After all, true terror lies in the unknown, and this, I knew, would be one of those night tales I'd never forget. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.